This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Sarah Cunnningham about her vibrant paintings that teeter on the edge of landscape and abstraction. Sarah recently wrapped up her first solo show at Lisson Gallery in London. That exhibition, titled The Crystal Forest, utilizes saturated colors and bold brushstrokes to invite viewers into spaces inspired by ecology, literature, and a sense of interconnectedness. And now, I walk through the Crystal Forest with artist Sarah Cunnningham. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Sarah, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you're at a dinner party seated next to somebody who has no idea who you are or what your work looks like. Where do you start to describe what it consists of?
Oh, that's a good way to start, Craig. So I like to think of myself as a painter. I work across a variety of scales and surfaces and materials. Everything that I paint and I make, it begins with my body. So my body, it's the vessel and the container for all of my feelings and memories that I translate into my painting and my language. My painting process is rooted in observation. So I want to get the complexity of all the things that I see and I experience into the work. I also tend to revisit similar motifs in nature over and over. And by doing this, it allows me to explore things very deeply. So there is this texture of thought and this building a richness of relationships, so to speak.
So if you're at that dinner party and somebody asks you to describe what a Sarah Cunningham painting looks like, how do you visually describe that to the stranger?
It's such a tricky question because every painting I make is so different and holds different ideas and emotions and stories. But I think that's exactly how I would talk about the work, that each work is an ancient shared inheritance that's been built over time. I'm thinking about how we build networks. Also, each painting and meaning differs according to the individual and the context. I'm very aware of people's associations with color and form. And what was beautiful about the show was, one, the fact it was in London. So I was able to physically be there and talk to people about the work. And some of the conversations that we had in the gallery was so much about Mark and, the undecidability of the image. And I think about that a lot, the uncanny and these rabbit holes of psychoanalytical ideas, so to speak. That's certainly something I think about. But I talk about each and every painting in a very personal way. So that's how I would do that if I was speaking with someone. I'm interested in their experience of the work.
Well, I mean, I guess we live in an age where you could just pull out your phone and show them an image and ask them what does it make them think?
Yes. Yeah. And, that I try and separate myself a little from the online, because I think we all leave this sort of collage trail of fragments behind us online. And particularly if you're involved in an intense body of work, I think it can be quite beneficial to separate yourself from that. And, you can look at 1,000 images before you even get out of bed in the morning if you choose to. And that can be quite problematic, I find, as a painter. But yes, everything is so readily available, isn't it, now?
Sure. So, I was reading an article about you the other day, and it sounds like you had an experience with a residency in Panama, I think going back like 5 years now, that really seemed to be a pretty formative experience for you. Can you kind of describe exactly what that opportunity was and kind of what that unlocked?
Absolutely, I'm really happy to because it's something that I hold very close to my heart and the community that I stayed with. I still talk to, and unfortunately, online and not in person. But the research residency that my work was selected by was called La Wayaka Current, and they form relationships with communities over a really long period of time. So, with the elders from this community, the Kuna community, they've been in relationship with them for over 10 years. So, it's a really beautiful thing. And I went to Armilla, which is a tiny island in the San Blas Islands. So you've sort of got Costa Rica and then the edge, whereas the San Blas Islands. And I went across there and stayed there for a month with this community. And my Spanish is not very good, so I spent a lot of time painting with members of the community, and we exchanged so much in that way. And I was really taken in by these ancestral connections to the forest. They're proven protectors of this forest and have been for a long time. And it's always something that I've held very close to me, the way my mum's brought me up, and she's always educated me ecologically in that way. But when I returned to England, which was a big shock after a month in the jungle, I went to the RCA and I was able to digest this experience and to find my gesture in paint. It's funny because the trajectory of things is so connected
Right.
because when I was at RCA, I actually read a text by Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, and this text is called The Crystal Forest, which is the idea behind the show. And he actually references the Kuna community that I stayed with, which was just serendipitous. I stumbled across this text. He talks about the forest as a crystal. So it's this multiplicity in this network, different sides and angles and perspectives, which is very much how the community see the forest as well. And I've been working within those parallels within my painting and myself for the last 3 years, really. But it's funny how things have unfolded towards this show. I feel like it's really an accumulation of all of that in a way.
And so that show, I guess it just recently ended at Lisson Gallery, the Crystal Forest. And, I think if one were to look at images from the show, I think they'd be struck by a couple things. One, color. Two, mark making. And three, you have forest in the title, but the work kind of teeters on abstraction. So can you talk a little bit about walking that fine line between, figurative and abstract?
Of course, it's a huge part of my studio that, as I said, with the forest, when you have the crystal forest as the title, we're naturally trying to find our footing in these untrodden paths. It's like snow when there's no footsteps. We're trying to find that footing, and the forest is a thinking metaphor. I've been trying to cultivate this forest-like mindfulness in my studio for some time, but I've sort of tapped on this before, but the associations that we make with marks and gesture are fascinating to me. It's something that I think about a lot. And during the show, there was we had conversations about buildings and elevators and bridges and urchins to origami. It's not that anything goes, because it's very much how the paintings are made. I'm always teetering on the very edge of something or somewhere, or not. It's like a high wire balancing act of painting. And you could say it is very intentional. I'm very aware of that. What I really love about painting is it sort of gives you this license in a way to have all of the things that you have and don't have in the same place. The things we recognize, we don't recognize, they're existing on one plane together. So it's almost like yin and yang philosophy. You can't have one without the other. All colors and shapes can be translated into yin and yang and yes and no, and they're interdependent and they chase one another. One thing I wrote down a few weeks ago that's just popped into my head, and a piece of paper that I've had crumpled in my pocket, is we often train our eyes to look for answers at eye level, but they're often inside, growing outward, and they're trembling and tangled, and they're changing all the time. And I think that's especially true for my painting, and the idea behind the show is that these landscapes are being carved out of the painting. The way the painting is made dictates that. It's not my projection that's preconceived onto it, if that makes sense.
I think so. I mean, I feel like there are probably a couple of things there. I feel like the viewer is searching for meaning and a foothold in the space, because you've kind of alluded to it being a landscape. And so the viewer's kind of struggling to figure out, like, where's the ground? What am I looking at? Also, it raises questions of just your process. Do you have those answers when you start, or are you working in a realm of intuition when you begin a work as you progress?
Absolutely. I have no, and this is what I meant with when they're carved out of themselves. It's like pulling the spirit out of a work. I don't work with any preparatory sketches. There's no formal roadmap whatsoever. That's danger territory for me when making a painting. I have to completely destroy or redirect that. So when I'm faced with a blank canvas, it's very much about establishing my relationship with my body and the surface. So this sort of is in the last 2 years that this has progressed, but I will start a painting on the floor, because this movement is so much more physical, and I'll use rags and brushes on sticks, and this bending over, reaching over, because the painting's flat, I can use the painting as a palette. So there's this texture of thought. It's really a thought process that's growing, and I have to move very quickly, particularly when I start a painting. I don't find it intimidating. That's one of the most beautiful things about painting. Everything's up for grabs with a blank canvas. It's a new conversation, but inevitably this conversation becomes older. And I work on a lot of paintings at once. They're like one big family. And I'll put paintings away for very long periods of time. And ideally, I want to forget about them, and forget what they look like. And then when I take them out, I can feel this urge to redirect something. But, I really sort of shy away from preconceived ideas about the resolve of a painting. And, and you said about viewers sort of struggling to work out what they're looking at. I think a lot of that is because it's such a fine line between that completion and that resolve. That's very intentional.
Earlier, you used the phrase forest-like mindfulness. What does that mean to you?
Um, so I obviously I've been thinking about the forest for a long time. I grew up next to a woodland when I was a child, and I realized the significance of that as I've gotten older. During COVID, I returned to that childhood woodland, and it was my studio for a lot of COVID. So these are significant actions in the work as a whole. But also to say that a forest is a metaphor is problematic in a way. We think of Bruno Latour and nature not being at our service, which it is not. And, I really acknowledge that. So when we think of Bruno Latour and nature not being at our service, and this was a few years ago, and I started to read Eduardo Kahn and to listen to his interviews with Donna Haraway. And there's a text by him called How Forests Think, an Anthropology Beyond the Human. And what he describes is these semiotics and this way of thinking with the forest, which is something that I have incorporated into the studio with all of my materials and all of my detritus, the forest floor. I allow the paint to build up on the floor, and it's not that I consciously think of it as a forest, but these semiotics are there. It's also similar to why I work at night, because I'm trying to avoid systematic ways of thinking, and I feel when I'm alone with the work at night, it's a lot less systematic in that way.
I've always been kind of captivated by the semiotics of what's going on under the surface of a forest, how this network of fungi that actually connects like a network the entire forest, and how trees will borrow resources from each other.
Incredible.
Do you feel like you imagine your work, your practice living inside of a network like that?
Absolutely. Even the way that we curated the Lisson show, so much of that is about surface, because scale is hugely important to me. The micro, the macro, when you think about the forest floor, looking up at the canopy, like that's so relevant to scale and how we look at painting. And in the show, there was linen, canvas, and board, so birch ply. And these are four really small paintings. And by sort of isolating those surfaces, it's again, that is also to do with semiotics. Like with a board, the painting usually happens in one sitting. It happens very quickly, and you can remove the paint from the board because it doesn't soak and eat it up in the way that linen does. So you've also got these stretches and of time that's also condensed, and um, that's why we curated the show in the way that we did. Even with the triptych and the way it was made, when I've got a body of paintings in my studio, like a family, the left hand side of the triptych was an individual painting. The right side of the triptych was a different painting. They were at a point where they weren't friends at all. And by bringing them together, I was responding to the tensions there and sort of married them to become a diptych. And that sat there for, half a year. And I put it in the naughty corner that I like to call it, where I put paintings that I don't want to think about for a while. And I took it out and realized that it needed a central canvas. So by adding a blank canvas, you have to mix your paint well, because you're responding to two nearly finished paintings. But it was so physical in the act that I was peeling the landscape back, you know, bringing life to this surface in a sense of time, but also peeling the landscape back. And it's so that came out of a network. So I'm constantly in conversation with things in that way. But it's probably I see it as the main protagonist of the exhibition
Mhm.
because it's the only painting where we're sort of looking out of the crystal forest. And I loved what you said about the underneath the forest floor and
Mhm.
how trees sort of warn younger trees about diseases, and it's this caring but this insatiable becoming as well. If I could have one emotion with my work that I would like people to feel is to feel hopeful. And when they're looking out of, this forest, to remember what we've lost, but also who we are and what we can become.
The story you were just telling about the triptych, that's really interesting because, it sounds like your process is really rooted in the intuition in the moment, but you saw a deficiency, and the result was your need to create something that filled the gap. Like that middle part would have to be a lot more deliberate to fix the deficiency in your mind. Like, did you find it difficult to create with that intention versus intuition to fill that gap?
Um, I wouldn't say I found it difficult because if something is feeling difficult or frustrating, it's usually not worth doing unless you're sort of using that frustration as a direction for the painting. So when I have a sort of urge, or which I need to have that urge to go in to a painting. When I go to the studio, I'm not looking at work. I'm picking up the pieces of the night before and waiting for that urge and that entry, which is what I had when I introduced that blank canvas. I just had to respond very quickly, and it was still painted in rapid bursts. It was a case of just knowing my palette and the colours that had happened before, but also removing a lot of paint. That's a huge part of it, with rags and scraping paint back. That I'm trying to create this sense of time, and this with that triptych in particular. If you look, there's these pockets of space and time throughout it. But yes, it was quite a strangely deliberate action, because I'm usually thinking about the work as a whole, and things do fragment and collapse naturally, but the title, I will look into the earth, is so apt for that act of peeling it back and opening it up again. And I'd say, I'd go as far to say that was quite a spiritual experience in a way.
You mentioned earlier the conversations you had at the gallery, being there when viewers were able to see your work. Because, like conversations I have with the artists, when the work is done, it's only half done because in the end, it's a collaboration with the viewer, right? So, what sort of things were you hearing from the viewer? What emotions and ideas was your work evoking in these people?
Sure. It's often very physical. Things can be either so specific. with I've had people tell me about paintings that have made them think about childhood memories that they've had, or gardens. But there's also a lot of people will say that there's this pulling feeling or sinking feeling into the landscape, particularly the painting the crystal forest, which is again the title of the show. But this one work, it's like, someone said to me it was a river journey into the twilight zone, and I thought that sounds like it's come just out of the crystal world, the text. So it's also, I have a lot of conversations about blue and my use of blue. I've always had a very emotional relationship with color, and I hope that that's passed on. We make so many associations with blue. It can be used to create space and water and ice and sky, but it's always very naturally propelled me across the surface, and I find a lot of sadness and energy in blue. So that was also discussed a lot during the show.
It's interesting. Some of the color palettes that you use, obviously, there's this push and pull between the complements of like the cool blues and the warm reds and oranges. But just the palettes of some of the work kind of evokes memories of different artists from art history. Like your triptych, there's something about that palette reminds me of some of Cézanne's landscapes from the south of France. And some of these, the blue works kind of evoke some of the palettes I think of with Gauguin when he was in Tahiti. Is that me bringing my baggage, or are these things that you think about, or are these things that are subconscious? Or
Yeah, so I look at a lot of painting. I don't. And you're not the first person to say the Cézanne reference, which is funny because I've not studied and looked at Cézanne for some time. Um, I do look at a lot of painting. However, I love Bomberg and his series Bomb Store, where he was commissioned to visit a unit full of explosives. And when you look at those paintings, particularly my use of Prussian blue and this sort of automatic painting, there's this darkness to those paintings. They're beautiful. Um, Pierre Bonnard, I think, rather than Gauguin,
mm-hmm.
he's a big influence for me, or has been at least as of late. Um, there's something about his intense use of colour that becomes the subject of the work.
Right.
But I don't really look at older paintings in a stylistic way like that. It's for Bonnard, it's specifically his bath paintings, and it's more how the bathroom opens up to become this liminal space. I'm more interested in that aspect as opposed to palette and stylistic things that have happened. But obviously, there is the weight of everything that's happened before me, and like most painters, I'm very aware of that.
Somebody was telling me that you're a bit of a night owl. Is that right?
Yes, I am, and unfortunately, so my morning is my evening in a way. So I will. I was up late painting last night actually, so I will wake up. I often read a lot. I'm a big believer in breath work and yoga and easing myself into the day in a way. But when I get to the studio, it's very much like I said, I'm avoiding looking at any work and picking up the detritus and the pieces. But I just feel this urgency to paint at night and to be alone with the work. And it's this tiredness that brings a less systematic way of thinking as well that I've certainly noticed. But I do really value my rest, and I think it's important. As I understand my temperament more and more as a painter, as I get older, it's incredibly important how you talk to yourself and how you treat yourself both inside and outside the studio. So yeah.
So what is it about the middle of the night that attracts you? I mean, is that just when your clock says that you're able to focus better? Is it the quiet, the fact that, there are no interruptions? What attracts you to it?
I think that it's a hugely philosophical thing for myself and the work. Um, I mean, don't get me wrong, I do paint in the day sometimes. I treat my time the way I treat my paintings. It's a network. and the natural light is really important. It's a lot more forgiving for
Mhm.
starters. Um, but with the night, often I'll be painting as I'm hearing the dawn chorus and the sunrise.
Mhm.
And, it's like what I said about carving the painting out of itself, like that sunrise and that time throughout the night is intrinsic to that. Um, it's almost like time feels like it's leaking away, and there's this super saturation of space where anything present within that leakage, um, in a way begins to crystallize. That's also where the title of the show came into things. Um, some paintings become so dark when I'm painting at night, and then as the sun's coming up, I'm pulling the painting back out of itself. And when I leave the studio, it often feels it's like purple rain, it's like the end of the world in a way. And it's not that I have to leave the studio on a good note. It's not that I'm going home with a big grin on my face, but it feels very philosophical for what we have that's happening right now and where we're going, and this new temporality and lineage that we're all going through, that I think, especially after COVID, um, sort of came into our lives.
It's really interesting the notion of finishing each day with a sunrise. I mean, that's just so hopeful. So it sounds like it brings light and hope back into each of your sessions at the end.
Absolutely. The paintings really rely on reverie and hope. And, don't get me wrong, that's certainly not always the case. But it's very intrinsic to that, for sure. There was a painting in the show called Night Bus Home, and it's one of the small panels on birch ply. And it's strange because my works are not always that directly autobiographical, and that happened really haphazardly. But when I look at that work in retrospect, I see the upper deck of the N28 in the morning as the sun's coming up, and you've got these flashes of red, and the street lights going by, and the sun in the right periphery that's coming up. Um, so yeah, it speaks to something much larger.
Where do we go from here? I assume you're back in the studio. Where's your work headed? Is it more of what we've seen in the Crystal Forest, or are you finding new directions?
Absolutely finding new directions. I'm back in the studio and I'm experimenting, which is a beautiful time, and it's a good time to have. So, I mean, I don't like talking about things too much before they happen because I work through things
Right.
physically. Um, but I am really keen to incorporate more of my materials into my work, like the rags and the marks and the discarded um, materials around the studio. They have history and marks too, and they're significant in that way. There's so much scope in this way of thinking and working, this constructing, deconstructing, this constantly unfolding. I'll always be concerned with how I can find these unknown sounds and how I can interrupt and change and rewire a painting while I'm in the act of making it. That will always be the case. But I have also acquired this heavy duty sewing machine recently.
Ah.
And I'm hoping to sort of revisit a work that I made last year where this linen had been stitched um, together and hand stitched as well with offcuts, um, both off stretcher and on stretcher. I want to take painting somewhere else whilst still working with the raw physicality of paint. Um, all of the protrusions and dribbles and entanglements. but both in and outside of the paintings. But watch this space, we'll see.
Do you find it easy to do these experimentations at a small scale, or do you attempt to experiment in bigger work? An artist like you who starts with, a 6x6 canvas on the floor, do you sketchbook?
I do draw. I don't like sketchbooks. I don't like the way that everything is sort of, you can't get it out and look at it, because drawing for me is really a way of being able to see what I'm thinking. So I do draw, but I never make a drawing or, for example, a watercolor study that directly informs a painting. This is something that happens as a way of thinking. I also use a lot of masking fluid with my watercolors, so they really are quite developed, similar to that of the oil paintings. So, I love paper. I actually come from a collage background as well, and that's intrinsic to how I layer and how I paint. I love working small, and it will always be my true love in painting, this intimacy that you get when you've got a painting in your hand, and the gestures from the wrist rather than the arm. They also happen very quickly. So, there's always small paintings that are being made. And with the larger paintings, it's a very different relationship. Most of them I can sort of operate within my own wingspan, and I'm mapping out the space, so to speak. And these conversations can become very old. And there's lots of arguments and paintings that you think, is this ever going to resolve? But eventually, they often end up the best paintings that you make, in a way. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does. So, Sarah, if people wanted to follow your trajectory, I don't know if you have another show coming up or what's in the works, but is there a website? Or I guess people can go to the Lisson website. Where's the best place for folks to follow you?
Well, I'd say the Lisson website. There's some works from the show on there. I'm also on Instagram, but I don't use it too frequently. As I said before, it's not always the most helpful thing to have out there. But ideally, I know it's not always convenient, but I think to see my works in the flesh, for people to see them in real life, there's such complexity, and they're so tactile, and they're about touch, and a lot of that you just cannot get from the screen. It's that's the one thing that people said throughout the whole show, was how surprised they were at how the paintings worked, how they looked in person, and the surface.
You can't replace scale, right? I mean, what it really feels like to interact with something in person. So
Absolutely.
Well, Sarah, I appreciate so much your time today and your willingness to sit down and kind of open up and take us by the hand into your crystal forest. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for a beautiful conversation, Craig.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.